thank you for that introduction. So I don't know if this is more of a sign of my fear of commitment, really, but I work with a lot of organisations and came to Australia about 4 years ago and came because of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So at the time I was doing a lot of work in the UK of our version of that, which we called personalisation. Of course we did. At the time, the people who were developing the National Disability Insurance Scheme were looking at the UK and other countries. And I suppose myself and colleagues got pretty excited about this scheme and what it could offer. And it's almost been kind of, a real pleasure, if you like, to then arrive in Australia, working with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and then also being part of the transformation in aged care, which is being called consumer-directed care. So it's been a pretty interesting experience, and I'm going to draw on some of my experience in the UK as well as with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and probably if we were sitting having a glass of wine, we'd probably get into the kind of, did it turn out to be the best scheme in the world? There's some debate about that. But anyway, that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be sharing this is the world according to Kate Fulton, so take it with a pinch of salt. I'm an expert on nothing. I have been around human services since I was 16 and have seen a lot of change. And I'm pretty obsessed with welfare systems. So I've worked in Canada, in the States, in some parts of Europe. And, you know, I'm the first person to really get into how can welfare systems change to really give choice and control to people. But I suppose what I've learned is that the welfare systems are one thing that needs to change, but actually where I see the most change and innovation is in people's living rooms and in real practice. So I want to draw on that. And hopefully it gives you something to think about. It might be a bit challenging, but I'm sure it'll give you something to have some debate about over coffee. So this is a fairly simple description of self-directed support, and this was developed by In Control, Scotland, and it's kind of profoundly simple. You know, self-directed support is about people being in control of the support to live the life that they choose. And what I'm seeing is where schemes talk about being self-directed, they've kind of latched on to the first part of that sentence, not necessarily the second part. So to be in control of the support, not always to live the life that you choose. So just bear that in mind because I'm going to be coming back to it. And it is nothing new. So this is a map that Citizen Network did last year. We had a big study looking at where were schemes that demonstrated some of these qualities, self-directed support. Where were they operating? And what you'll see is the areas in yellow are the countries where they have some version of these schemes in place. And you know, it's building on 50 years worth of practice and experience. So in some countries, it's called individualized funding. In others, self-directed support. They've all got slightly different names, slightly different ways of working, but it's been going for a long time. One of the difficulties that certainly I've experienced in trying to learn a bit about self-directed support internationally is we all use different words and language to describe things. So a few years ago, I did a study on what we called in the UK brokerage. So basically, they are a kind of navigator to help people navigate the scheme, for want of a better word, right? And I started to look at, well, what else is going on in the world around brokerage, and really struggled to find examples and find literature on it. And then what I discovered is actually the same role is there, we just call it different things. So in Canada, it's called independent facilitation. In the States, it's service brokerage. And the NDIS, this kind of navigator role, they've called that the intermediaries, just to be helpful. So so there's lots of different terminology around this thing called self-directed support. But essentially, I think self-directed support, at the heart of it, is around taking the power and the cash as close to people and families as possible. The places where, or this is one slide that just gives you an indication. That study that we did last year around where's self-directed support happening for people, this gives you some sense of self-directed support works for everybody. You know, if we go back to that kind of original description, being in control of the support to live the life you choose, there are examples of this kind of approach being used with, you know, people who experience homelessness, people who are connected to the child protection system, older people, people with a disability. So it is certainly something that I think works for everybody. One of the ways of thinking about this is on the, well, it's on my right, your left. I think the shift that we're talking about when we talk about self-directed support is from that side over to this side. So largely, if you look at any country, any welfare system, citizens pay taxes, and out of those taxes there is a contribution to the welfare system, and government makes decisions about how best to use that money. And you know, traditionally that money is ploughed into different services, and then we as recipients, if you like, are then looking at which service best meets what we're looking for in our lifestyle. And I suppose what we're learning is, to some extent, it's pretty inevitable we're never going to get that right, that model, because we're all incredibly different. So when you plough money into predetermined services, there's a fair chance you're going to be trying to find something that is a close fit, but not necessarily the right fit. And I think the place where we're heading, or the kind of underpinning philosophy of self-directed support, is much more around you have an entitlement to some funding, but that has to be used in the context of your community and in your lifestyle. So how do we use that in a way that makes sense? And I'll certainly be telling you some stories about what that looks like. So I suppose my view is, I don't think there'd be many people in this room who would disagree with that. You know, being in control of the supports that you need to live the life that you choose. But what I'm learning, and this is not just an Australian phenomenon, it's certainly international, is we're in a pretty interesting context in Australia. And this is my kind of simple way of being able to see it, that we've kind of bought into the whole notion of consumerism. So if you look at things like consumer-directed care, I mean, even the term consumer-directed care, and things like the National Disability Insurance Scheme, it's, you know, it's about getting hold of the cash and then going shopping, you know, choosing the organisation that's going to do the right things for you. And I suppose what I've learned, despite, you know, I'm a massive fan of shifting the money, massive fan of moving the money closer to people and families, but what I've learned is shopping doesn't cut it. It isn't all about shopping, because actually a lot of the experiences that people are facing, you know, whether that be an older person, a person with a disability, a person who experiences mental health, a lot of the things that they are experiencing actually, I think, sit much more around social justice issues. And shopping won't solve social justice issues. And, you know, what I've seen in the UK and in Australia, that certainly if I look at the disability sector, this kind of consumerist perspective, you know, government tells us they now are in charge of creating a marketplace. And what I've seen happen is organisations getting themselves shiny, rebranding. I think marketing has had a real kind of boost with the disability transformation and the aged care transformation. So I've personally worked with lots of organisations who've rebranded themselves. Usually the new names tend to be higher up the alphabet because as consumers go and look into the marketplace, the ones who are higher up the alphabet are the ones that you see first in the catalogue. And so working with organisations who've kind of bought that, you know, that's what it's all about. And what I see, the real danger with that is we've been turned into, and I'm saying we in terms of support organisations, we've been turned into suppliers. You know, that's what it's all about now. We're in this marketplace of supply. The organisations that we used to collaborate with, we now want to kill them. And, you know, they are now our competition. So it's like we've kind of bought into it, right? Where we've kind of, yeah, we've got straight into it. But like I say, you know, I've worked in human services since I was 16, and I don't think shopping is going to answer some of the questions or get us close to some of the issues that people are really facing. So I'm putting that up front, really, because I think unless we pay attention to people's citizenship, and by that I'm talking about the stuff that really matters to people, people being connected to their communities, living a life that they choose in relationship, unless we pay attention to that, I think we're going to be sitting here in 10 years' time saying, well, that was good, we moved a lot of money, we moved the money, we moved it closer to people and families, but actually not much has changed, other than people can choose from one, I don't know, shitty provider from another shitty provider. Now, it's being a bit blunt, but I'm doing it deliberately. You know, I just want you to kind of see, actually, is this the space that we want to be in? Is this really the answer? So, I suppose in some of the ways to kind of combat some of this, these are some of the experiences that I've had that I think are worth paying attention to. And I'm going to go through them and hopefully illustrate them with some examples that help you think about them. But I'm going to start with individually designed solutions. So one of the, like you said, I trained as a social worker years ago, and I only did that because I was an angry advocacy worker at the time, angry at the system, and would come back to the office regularly and say things like, what the hell do they teach these social workers? You know, they're off their heads, like they're coming up with solutions that don't help. And anyway, so I decided to train to find out what it was that they were teaching them. And one of the things that I did when I was training as a social worker was I spent a year of that course learning about assessment. And apparently there's a lot to assessment. There's lots of different tools and techniques. And I suppose I kind of was taught to become a need hunter. Okay, so I can go looking for needs, wrapped up in all different forms of assessment, but that was the kind of paradigm that I have been taught and developed, really, since I was 16 in human services. So looking for needs, and where that has taken me is to human service solutions or strategies. So you've got these needs, somebody mentioned before this kind of deficit model, you've got these needs, therefore these are some of the services and strategies that are going to work for you. And yeah, I don't know, about 10 years ago, as I got involved in this thing called self-directed support, the question changed that I started to ask, and the question was, what will it take for you to have a good life? Okay, so instead of what are your needs, the question was down this end of the slide, what will it take for you to have a good life? And there's no doubt about it, that has completely changed my practice. It's completely changed the solutions that seem to come up when you go down that line of questioning. And to just give you an example, so it's not in this sector, but the reason I'm using it is I think it really powerfully demonstrates where we can end up if we ask those questions and not those questions. Within Citizen Network, we did some work within child protection, and I don't really know what kind of an audience you are yet, but believe you me, right, child protection is a hard audience to crack, right? And we were doing some work in one particular local authority in the UK, and they were working with a family of 8 children who all of the 8 kids were on the at-risk register. So there was some genuine reason to be concerned for these kids' safety and well-being. And the local authority had done it had gone down that route. It had come up with its service solutions and strategies, and a lot of them in child protection are wrapped up in positive parenting. So basically, we think you aren't a very good parent, therefore we've got a range of classes or courses that we think you should do to make you a better parent. And they'd already done all that, right? So that in itself had cost money, so just bear that in mind. And none of that had worked, and this, the CEO of the Child Protection Department, they were at the point where the kids were going to be removed. And in the UK, to remove a child into the protection of the state, on average, it's about £2,000 a week per child. So you're talking, I don't know, 16 grand for these kids per week to be removed, right? And because we were doing this work around self-directed support, I think partly because of the economics and obviously the human cost, we were encouraged to go and work with this family. And we went along and we came from this paradigm. So what will it take? And you can imagine, you know, as a family, I think they'd kind of pretty much had their fair share of human service workers, but we went along and asked the question, what would it take for this family to work? What would it take for you to be a functioning family and to live well? And as a kind of throwaway comment, Dad said, I'll tell you what it would take. I need a job. And it turned out that Mum and Dad had worked in industry in this part of the UK that wasn't particularly affluent, and a lot of the industry had closed down, and from then they hadn't been able to get work, and life had kind of spiraled out of control, really. So he says, I'll tell you what it would take is for me to get a job. And so we asked, well, what would that take? And he says, well, to be a plasterer, I've looked at being a plasterer over the years, to be a plasterer, it costs £700 to do the course. Okay. So I reckon there's a reoccurring theme coming in my presentation, but we went back to child protection and said, so it turns out what the family think the right support might be is that Dad gets a trade. And you can, well, guess what they said? We don't do that. But I seem to get a we don't do that in a lot of places that I work. So yeah, we don't do that. That's not our department's issue. You know, that's about work. And okay, so let's just get this clear. You're about to spend 18 grand a week without spending 700 for a solution that the family might work. And I think the economics was a decent lever, so they did. And within a year, all of those children were off the at-risk register, and within 18 months, there was no social services involvement in that family's life, right? So that's not, I mean, we talk about creativity and innovation. That's not particularly innovative or particularly creative. I think it's pretty ordinary. But to the departments, you know, that is like wild. And I'm talking, you know, they were terrified that this might get into the headlines. They were terrified that this is not the usual, you know, down that end, human service strategy or support. But if we really believe that people are the experts in their own lives and they can design the solutions that are going to make sense, chances are they might not buy some of that human service stuff, right? Another example in our sector is a few years ago, there in Brighton, in the south of the UK, the General Hospital, there was a big problem, and this seems to be a recurring problem wherever you go. There's a big problem with older people who had a fall, go into hospital, and when they were ready for a discharge, social services basically not getting their act together and getting people out of hospital quick enough. So, you know, this is brilliant, but what happened was that one government department started to fine the other government department for not getting people out, for bed blocking, basically, right? So they brought together a number of kind of smaller organisations to say, so here's the problem, you know, we're fining them, we can't get people out quick enough, what might it take to do this? And there's a really small organisation called Help and Connect in Brighton that they had quite a big volunteer network, had the conversation, what would it take? And what they asked was that a volunteer from Help and Connect would talk to the person who was ready for discharge according to the hospital first and ask them what it might take for them to return home safely. And the kind of conversations that happened were things like, what it would take is if somebody could come round during the week. My son can pop in at the weekend, but if somebody could come round during the week to help me have some bread or milk in the house, or, you know, again, fairly ordinary solutions. They started that project, and within 6 months, they reduced referrals to social services by 60%. And that's just in the initial kind of people leaving hospital. That was long term. So people didn't access human services supports. They accessed a network of people that were local until they were well. And then what often happened is people then joined that network. You know, it worked for me, therefore I'm willing to do that for somebody else. So another example in this sector again is, this is a guy who AVIVO worked with, and Mr. Mandel, he had a degenerative condition, and he was entitled to some support, and AVIVO asked the question, what would it take for you to live a good life? He was adamant he wanted to stay at home. What would it take? And Mr. Mandel was pretty clear he didn't want any strangers coming into his house and supporting him, that was something that his family would do. Okay, so what would that take? And he had some older sons and daughters who lived in Perth and another daughter who lived abroad. And together as a family, what would that take? They designed a support system where the sons and daughters who lived in Perth provided his support, and I think it was about every 6 to 8 weeks. He used some of his funding to fly his other daughter to his house so that they could have a break. Some of his funding paid for their break, which was, they were Buddhists, they went to a Buddhist retreat. And, you know, brace yourself, but you know, if it got in the headlines of the newspaper, it was the flights. That's what he used his funding on, flights for his daughter and retreats for his other kids, right? So a retreat place for his other kids. So I suppose I'm telling you these stories to hopefully help you see that if people are really in control of the kind of supports that are going to make sense in their life and in their context, that might not be the stuff that we're really familiar with, which has a big impact, I think, on some of our businesses and some of our business models, I think. Probably the other thing just to say about that is this thing about creativity. You know, I think there's a kind of real danger in it that I am yet to see something that we call innovative that isn't, if you take it outside of human services, isn't perfectly ordinary. So I've worked with so many workers in human services who will say, you know, our bosses want us to be creative and innovative, but we've got no money and we don't know what to do with that. Well, my suggestion would be look to the real world and look at the ordinary stuff that's going on, because human services have seemed to repackage that as innovative. So, yeah, so I think it's worth just bearing in mind. So my second point is around the mechanism. So like I say, I love looking at welfare systems and looking at how they operate. And I have definitely learned that some of those schemes, if the money is flexible and is as close to people and families as possible, that's a brilliant thing. But I am also yet to find a government in any of those countries that I've mentioned that's particularly innovative. Like, my understanding now is it's not government's job to be innovative, it's government's job to lay the foundations for people to innovate. And I suppose what I'm seeing as the NDIS is rolling out, there's a lot of anger about this is not what, it's not delivering what we thought it would. I've not seen a government scheme deliver innovation yet, you know, but what I have seen is schemes that allow people to work flexibly. That's where the real innovation happens. But one of the kind of, I suppose I've mentioned this thing about, if you look in the NDIS particularly, if government isn't flexible, what happens is some of what we're seeing now, which is people are leaving those schemes with prescriptions because of this consumerist perspective. You know, you've got a plan that says 4 hours of this, 2 hours of that, 1 hour of this, that's what you're entitled to, or a place at here, a place at that. Now you go shopping to the marketplace and purchase that. That is not self-directed support. That's shopping. So I suppose I can feel the tension in a real way, you know, in day-to-day reality of people who are going through these schemes with a prescription, but not really helpful assistance to think about what might make sense. This is a concept. So I suppose what I think in terms of shifting the money is, unless we change our thinking, then, you know, the UK was a brilliant example of when we first developed personalisation and direct payments. It was brilliant. We were dead proud of ourselves. We'd managed to convince government to give the cash to people instead of giving it to providers. And we're really happy that, you know, 4 or 5 years down the line, people have got the cash and they're choosing the organisations. And about 4 or 5 years down the line, people and families started to say to us, well, that's all very well. Yeah, I've got the cash. But actually, the only stuff I can buy is the same rubbish that you bought for me 5 years ago. And what you'd see is, and I had a real experience in Western Australia. I was supporting a man who had a long history with mental health services to leave an institution. And we'd looked at what might it take, and part of what that looked like had a kind of community network. He needed more than paid support. You needed real people who care about him in his life. And we interviewed 3 different organisations and said, so this is what we're looking for. And in different ways, what they came back with, they listened, said, yeah, we're really person-centred. What we do is this. And it was like, you know, the dodgy car salesman, they kind of went like that. We have this menu. You can choose from that. It's all person-centered. The classic now is bespoke. So it's all bespoke, but it looks a bit like that. Does that make sense? So this kind of, you know, we're using language in a really interesting way. And I suppose what I think people and families would share is that this concept's a concept developed by a guy called John O'Brien and Pete Ritchie. And they talk about the way that human services have developed is it's like we've developed a parallel universe that kind of does the same kind of stuff, but in a way that's subtly different, that has a significant impact. So if you imagine, for the majority of us, we live in the real world, where we have, I don't know, we decide how we're going to live our lives, we decide what's going to happen in our life. And then in service land, it's kind of a bit duller, and we talk the same, but different things happen. So really, a classic example for me is I've worked in human services since I was 16, and if I go temping bowling in my real life, I never go temping bowling in my real life because I've worked in a day centre for too long, so it's not something I choose to do now. But if I go temping bowling in my real life, I go in the evening with friends, we have food, usually there's quite a bit of alcohol, and the activity, you know, is kind of the secondary thing, if you like. It's the socialising is the main activity. What I see happen is people go temping bowling, so particularly people with an intellectual disability, people go temping bowling at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, where there's hardly anybody else in the bowling alley other than other people who are connected to human services. And there's no food, there's no alcohol, we're lucky if we get a coffee. And so can you see me point? It's kind of, we do the same, but actually it has a really big impact on the experience for people. And I think one of the things that certainly John O'Brien talks about in relation to service land is it does some of these things. That it disconnects people. That once you're connected to human services, there's a real danger that actually you are isolated from the rest of community and isolated from those relationships that you had previously. We don't really use community resources in a way that the rest of the world do. You know, like I've just demonstrated, there are hundreds of examples once you start going looking for them. And that people's labels become the most important thing about them. And probably the kind of critical thing, I heard this concept when I was 18, and I was working in a group home and thinking, you know what, I'm trying really hard here. I am working flexibly. I am trying to do things a bit differently. And then what I was pretty scared about is I got back to work and noticed that I was doing the stuff that he'd talked about, that if somebody had a passion for drama, the next thing you'd know, I'd find them some kind of disabled drama group or some mental health drama group, instead of what's it going to take for you to be part of a community out there of other people who like drama. So, yeah, I think it's really powerful, and I suppose what I believe is, like the UK experience, if we don't change our thinking, all we're doing is moving money, and what people can get is the same stuff. Okay, they're just some examples of, depending on whatever sector you're in, you know, this kind of service land mentality is out there, breathing, living, and doing well. Yeah. Probably the other area that I've learned is, despite governments telling us we're in a marketplace, actually what happens in people's living rooms, what happens in relationship is what makes the difference. And what drives that, I think, is some kind of solid principles or values. And this is an organisation that is based in WA, and it's been around for about 50 years, I think, and it's one of the largest shared management providers in WA. And shared management is a concept that's been around for a while in the disability sector, which is basically people have their funding and they take on different bits of responsibility. So the provider might do it all, or they might do some of it. So it's a kind of partnership. That's what they're looking for. And they've applied that in the kind of aged care context. So irrespective of the scheme, you know, this is the way that we work. We work in partnership with you, and we work in partnership for you to take on bits of that responsibility that makes sense to you. And about 4 years ago, we had a scheme, the old hack funding, we used that funding to be self-directed. So what that meant was that people got a budget, and there were really small budgets. That's part of the reason why we were particularly interested in it, because everybody tells us there's not enough money. And actually these budgets were £3 grand, £5 grand, £7 grand, £12 grand. So you went through the assessment process and you were deemed to have £5 grand, £12 grand, whatever the budget was. And then there was some assistance to help people think about what it would take. And the kind of solutions, you would have guessed it, are not the kind of typical solutions that people came up with. So one woman who was part of this scheme, she was a woman who was connected to the mental health services. She'd gone through a number of different organisations, and when I first met her, she said to me, I don't want any more dough faces. And what that meant was, you send me young girls who don't know much about trauma, whose idea of success is to sit in my living room and look at me like that. And for me to have a cup of coffee with them and be nice, and for them to leave, that's what you lot think is success. And, you know, sadly, I can really see that. Anyway, she had a budget of about £5 grand. You know, what would it take for you to have a good life? The kind of solution she came up with is she was living in social housing that was pretty scary. There were her back garden. She was into permaculture and gardening. As far as she was concerned, that had a big impact on her well-being. She lived where there were 2 high-rise blocks behind her garden where people would shout in. So what would it take? It would take a shade cloth over my garden so I could spend some time in there safely. What would it take to have a good life? She'd experienced significant trauma. It would take reconnecting with my brother, who also experienced significant trauma. What would that take? A mobile phone? What would that take? You know, a flight to see him. So you get me point. You know, if we really believe people are directors and have got their own solutions, it'll take us in interesting places, despite small amounts of money. Or my experience is it takes us in interesting places even when there's little money there. So I'm just going to go past that. My next point is to keep it simple, right? And I suppose one of the things that I've learned, like I say, since I was 16, human services, I've learned the language of human services. So even with good intention, you know, we use some language that make it nigh on impossible to have any idea what we're talking about. So when we talk about choice and control, it would be a good idea if we started to talk ordinary, so people had some sense of what's going on. And just to illustrate that, you know, I'm sure if you here representing organisations, you'll say that you're person-centred or bespoke, if that's your new one. But we've now got person-centred furniture, believe it or not. Just to give you an indication, right, I went home on a Friday night and said to my partner, this weekend I'm going to be really person-centred with you. And guess what he said? Will it hurt? So even that, you know, with the best of intentions, we're talking something that is a kind of nonsense and paradigm to service land, not something that ordinary folk talk about, think about. So really profoundly simple stuff. You know, the more complicated we make it, the less chance people have got to really direct their supports and navigate it. And I suppose that this point about being open to yes, you know, if we don't make these schemes flexible, if we don't respond in a way that's flexible, then you'll be waiting a long time for government to do it. And certainly if I look at the NDIS, I really believe people taking hold of the cash themselves will have an impact on the market. But I also really believe that organisations who are willing to work in partnership with people will make this scheme, not the scheme in itself. With AVIVO, this is older people. So one of the kind of challenges we've always had in relation to older people is in both the UK, Canada. People will say older people don't really want to direct their support. You know, they just want you to organise it for them and send a girl round. And that's not been my experience. But what has been my experience is following social workers or planners or navigators, whatever terminology scheme you're in, following them and watching them how they have the conversation. So if you have a conversation that goes a bit like this, so we can see you need X, Y, and Z, so I can organise that for you and sort that out, and I can either send a girl on Tuesday or we can get the organisation to come out and talk to you about what they've got to offer tomorrow. If that's the conversation that happens, my nana's much more likely to go, okay, if the conversation is what would it take for you to stay at home and have a good life, my nana's much more likely to be part of that and part of those solutions. So what I've seen is a lot of the first conversation with workers. You know, we know the solution, here it is, this is what it looks like, and short of kind of opening your coat and bearing your wares, yeah, that's the conversation I see. This just gives you some indication of it's profoundly simple. You know, so at AVIVO, older people who are directing their supports, this is what they're looking for. You know, kind of simple stuff, yeah, and not necessarily a model of care or support. Okay, I'm running out of time. So I've mentioned about this whole kind of consumerist and social justice paradigm. And one of the things that I would kind of urge you to think about is this idea of being suppliers. You know, that's your job, is just to supply. Because the danger in where that takes us is that we're not having the creative conversation about what it might take to live a good life. That it's like that's already been done somewhere else, which actually, my experience is that conversation is more about what am I entitled to around funding. So if we're not having the conversation, I'm not sure the conversation's happening. AVIVO particularly, because they are working in this kind of paradigm of being a partner, not a supplier, their whole business model is changing, right? And that's driven by people. That's not driven by the board deciding we're going to change our business model. And this just gives you some indication of, in older people's context with home care packages, you know, this is still very early days, but at least a quarter of them are taking on some of the responsibility, you know, that shared management kind of paradigm, taking on the responsibility that they want to choose their support staff. They, in some circumstances, want to contract them directly, you know, through their funding. In other circumstances, they want AVIVO to employ them. But the idea that older people don't want to direct their supports is, you know, from my perspective, is nonsense, you know. And people are demonstrating it every day if they really have choice and control. So I suppose to finish, I wonder what would happen if we took a paradigm that was much more around citizenship. And for me, citizenship means being connected to community, having purpose and meaning, being in control of the direction of your life. What would that look like if we were more focused on that stuff than either being a recipient or a user or a purchaser or a consumer? That if people really, if we do believe that people have expertise in their own life, chances are people will look to community and relationships for some of those solutions. I do think the resources matter. You know, it is one part of the picture that unlocks citizenship, but it is only one part of the picture. And like I say, I think we're in danger of being 10 years down the line and spending a lot of money, a lot of time, energy, effort and money, moving money to just have the same stuff and that kind of service land stuff around. And yeah, if you're an organisation who's been pushed into this kind of supplier place, I would ask you to start thinking about the term partnership and what does that look like, because that is very different. Final thing just to mention is Citizen Network. So Citizen Network is an international network. Please go onto the website and join up. One of the kind of drivers behind Citizen Network is we can see there are some real learning, talent, innovation across all different sectors. You know, it's governments that departmentalise people, but actually the example of Dad, who's the plasterer, the example of Mr. Mandel, you know, the same stuff underpins it. So Citizen Network is trying to bring together people who are doing some interesting work, citizens who are doing some interesting work, to share some of those approaches. Yeah, so if you are interested, please join up and share what you're doing. So I hope that was helpful. It's very quick. Or maybe it wasn't for you. Right, thank you.